Hello, Tom Lebecky here with the latest edition of the New Theory Podcast. Now, talking about podcasting, we have one of the gurus on, the founder of PodSearch.com. His name is Dave Newmark, and we're going to see how they're positioning, I guess, a online, or I'm sure of an online, resource to find the right podcast for you. I can tell you before we have Dave on the show, iTunes kind of leads the charge. However, it's not a great aggregator or curator of podcasts that are right for me. And I think part of the reason is it's not a big money maker for Apple, and they're about making money. So I don't think they put a lot of resources into it. So I'm sure PodSearch is a solution, or I know personally for me, PodSearch is a solution to overcome this itch that I have to find the right podcast. Dave, welcome to the New Theory Podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Tom, and I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to share this news about podcasting and about PodSearch and all the things that you just talked about.
Well, so I can give you my perspective. There's half a million podcasts out there.
Right.
As a digital marketer, I encourage our clients to have podcasts. It's another promotional channel. You may or may not necessarily get a gazillion listeners. But, if you have a few hundred per episode, these could turn into paying clients or people that, become advocates for your brand. So we all know the explosion of podcasts. But one of the things I'm scratching my head with is there still does not, and I believe this is where PodSearch comes in, there's still kind of like an aggregator, curator, or kind of the Google of PodSearch. So first give us hey, what was the initial idea? How did you come across it? And B, more importantly, how did you implement it?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do it. Well, I came across it because I was in a meeting in 2016 that was related to podcast advertising. And what I was starting to hear in 2016 was that there was a vastly growing number of podcasts. And more and more the advertisers were finding it harder and harder to, because that's my background is advertising, podcast advertising. And they were finding it harder and harder to identify shows that would be great to sponsor. And at the same time, I was also hearing from friends and colleagues and others that it was harder and harder to find podcasts to listen to as a listener. So I thought to myself, gosh, this is really horrible because the content is fantastic. Why isn't there a way to bring it together? So I went to Google, and of course, as you pointed out, Google's a great search engine, but as a way to categorize or identify podcasts that might be interesting, it doesn't really, it's kind of random. And the apps are also really good at playing the podcast if you know what you want, but the categories are pretty broad and not that useful. So as a discovery medium or discovery mechanism, apps aren't that great. So I thought, well, what if I could create a portal for discovery of podcasts that was supported by the podcasters by reaching out to those who are looking for podcasts. And my model is to take a small fee from each, that's about $4.99 for each podcast, and pool that money together co-op style and use search, social, and other media to reach out to those people who are, and there's tens of millions of them, by the way, who are looking for podcasts, and then bring them into PodSearch where they can browse for free.
I love it, and this was the other part I was going to bring up, and I was going to bring it up first, but I don't want to be selfish. So when I first launched a podcast, I have a decent, magazine was somewhat established. We have a large family. I got a decent amount of friends. I launched my first podcast, and I had 30 downloads. And I thought, okay, that's the first day, and hey, I'm going to get some more, and nothing, and I had some notable guests on it, Gary Vee, Jordan Belfort, Al Sharpton, a whole bunch of other notable people, and those tend to do really well because of the fame of the person, and especially if they share in their own medium. But remember, I'm a digital marketer, so I have a leg up. So I was even okay, off the SEO accumulation, I will see the medium grow, and it just hasn't under my initial plan and strategy. So,
right.
So I had to do a lot of work to build it up. And, something like PodSearch, I would gladly pay $5 a month to
exactly.
even if I got, even if I got 50 listeners from it, 10 cents a listener isn't bad in this space. Once they subscribe and stay on and they stick with you, if the content's good, then it's on me. So I like that because a lot of people get into the podcasting game, but they don't know how to build their audience. So give us some of the specific tactics. I get it. You'll do some PPC and all that kind of fun stuff, but give us some of the specific stuff, the unique stuff that you're going to do to attract listeners.
Sure. Well, this actually goes right to the beginning of when I started PodSearch, because I was as curious as you were about, where are the listeners? Why can't they find my show? So with my colleagues, we went into search engines and we looked for the keywords and phrases that were very general, like how do I find a podcast or what's a great podcast? And guess what we found? We found 30 million plus people a month who are looking for podcasts. I know.
Wow.
And they're not typing in, they're not typing in, this podcast or that podcast, like, science or history or cooking or comedy or whatever. They're just saying, how do I find a podcast? What's a great podcast? And actually, that huge pool is not being addressed, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I'd like to just point out that Edison Research backs this up with numbers that they have done. Every March they do this thing called the Podcast Consumer Report. And what they found was that about 180 million people are aware of podcasting, but only 73 million of those, so 40% of 180 million, are listening regularly on a monthly basis. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so that gap is what we're after to close.
Okay. So I get on your site, and typical search engine, which is a good thing, very easy to use, good UI, UX. And I type in from, PodSearch, and I get, whatever comes up, right? And I've been testing it and tinkering with it. And what I did was I kind of picked the ones I know and like, and on purpose looked for it. And sure enough, the ones I was hoping came up did. And then when I did stuff I didn't know, it built a trust to look into other podcasts. So I kind of like that a lot.
I'm so glad.
Use an algorithm? Is it adaptive AI? What's the secret sauce? From the back end.
That is actually a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, because we don't use AI and we don't use algorithms to be predictive. So we're not trying to. What we're doing is we're making it like a pure directory, a little bit like I would say
the old Yahoo, right?
Well, it's actually more like Yelp. In the sense that, like, when you're looking for a Chinese restaurant and you're in some city that you're not familiar with, or even if your own city, you just feel like Indian food or whatever, it's not going to try and predict what you have had at previous restaurants and use information from third-party data and all that stuff. No, they're just going to give you a directory, and it's going to be sorted by whatever you want to sort by ratings or by price or by location or distance.
As Google and the other forms of search engines use different, algorithms, AI, and so forth, do you kind of use something like that for your back end, or do you use a more simplistic approach like a Yelp or something like that in order to serve up the right podcast for the right search term?
That's a great question, Tom. What we do is we're more like the Yelp model in that we give people the choices to be able to find what they want. So I don't know if a person is going to be interested in art and literature and also cooking and also gaming and history and science. I'm not going to try and pull third-party data or something like that, or using AI or predictive analytics to try and figure that out. I want this to be driven by the person and let them explore to their heart's content. And this actually goes to, I'm so glad you asked that question, because what it goes to is the format of what we're trying to do. So we go in a category and subcategory structure, and then from there you go to what's called a profile page. So the shows that you were talking about, finding and wanting to explore, once you get to that profile page, you can see all kinds of information. You can see a lot of description of the host, a lot of description of the show. But most importantly, we have what's known as a show sample. And those show samples are curated by us. And, there's some great ones. I'm thinking in particular, there's a show called Make Me Smart with Kai and Molly from American Public Media. And these are the hosts of Marketplace. And one of the show samples is with Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, and it kind of encapsulates that interview. The little snippet that we have of that interview encapsulates that that guy and his sort of like, roughness and everything. It's really interesting, but we work very carefully to, bring together as much information as possible. Then once you listen to some show samples and you look at the descriptions and all that, we then give you different ways to listen. So if you're on a mobile device and you're using PodSearch on a mobile device, we give you many different apps. If you're on an Apple phone, you can have the Apple Podcast app or Stitcher or others as well. But if you're about 30%, maybe a little more than 30% of our users are on desktop, and they're accessing PodSearch on a desktop. Yeah. And so what we do is we have in the Listen Now section a link to that podcast's website. And so when they have the various episodes on a website, we can take that listener right to it.
Oh, wow. But see, okay, so the reason why that's important is because sometimes when you find podcasts and you go, I just got Spotify. People are going to laugh. I just finally got it. But like sometimes before Spotify, I would go to a link that gave us something for the Spotify platform. The reason why I like it goes to the website is I can pick, hey, I'm an iTunes person, or I'm a Libsyn person, or whatever. So I love that, and that makes it easier. What about the podcaster? Analytics, as you know, is like the bane of my existence as a podcaster. Like I went over to Libsyn recently and had a 30% increase in listenership. Not because I did anything right. I got better analytics for SoundCloud, and I started out on SoundCloud because I was starting out, right? So my thing is, what kind of analytics can PodSearch give me? Is it a referral thing? I'll see in my Google Analytics. Do I get a dashboard? Do you supply something? How will I know it comes from your platform?
Right. We do provide that. We have a dashboard that enables you to see what kind of traffic is coming.
Nice.
We know that a sizable portion of the people who come to PodSearch, they only look at the tiles of the results page. So if they type in, let's say, American history, they'll see all kinds of shows dealing with that, but they will, they may not click on it and then go to the profile page. They may just go right to Apple Podcasts and then listen to the show. But we will show, not only what traffic is generated to your show, but also, what other activity is done. In addition to that, I should point out that there's a third element of PodSearch that I'd like to point out, and that is advertising.
Okay.
So what we do is we help find sponsors and advertisers for podcasters. So we have at the very top of our website, it says interested in podcast advertising, and we have two different pathways that we give advertisers. One is a do-it-yourself path, in which case the advertiser signs up for free, and then they can connect directly with the show. And we're not part of it. We don't have any insight as to what the conversation is. Nothing, and we don't take any commission. It's literally just a handshake, handoff. The other way that we help advertisers is that we have a service called PodSearch Ad, and it's really a traditional ad agency function. If they sign up for that, then we will help them. We get the regular standard, ad agency commission, but we will recommend podcasts to them. They might be ones that are on PodSearch, and they might be outside of PodSearch as well. And and we write the copy, we find the host, we do the prep calls, we monitor the spots, do all of that kind of stuff, as well as tracking the results from campaigns if it's a direct response campaign.
Okay. So I like it. Okay, so I want to make sure we're filtering this right. As a listener, I could pretty much find strong podcasts or podcasts of my interest. I saw this kind of like a My Pod Search, so you could almost create my own thing, which I like. I make it easier.
Like an advanced search, right? Exactly.
So I listen to podcasts in the car, and the worst thing is a toggle while you're driving. It's just frankly unsafe. iTunes does not do that for you. So that I love. As a podcaster, $5 a month, I'd be happy to. Again, if I got 50 listens a month from it, it's worth it, because acquiring a listener is very hard these days. So I love that. And then the third is, I in the past I used Advertise Cast and other ones where we did a revenue share. But frankly, they took a lot bigger chunk than the standard agency fee. So this seems like a home run for both listeners and podcasters. All right, Dave, how can we find you guys?
Well, people can find us by going to PodSearch.com. We also are in the App Store on Apple, and you can access us through Android as well on mobile.
Love it. Give us what's your favorite genre of podcasts?
Oh boy, I love several types. I would say that for news and politics, I love The Daily from the New York Times. It goes beyond the headlines. They usually take a topic. When I want to get riled up about politics, I listen to Pod Save America. There's a great show that's a 7-episode series about the corruption in government during the Watergate era called Bagman from Rachel Maddow. Really well done. When it comes to psychology, there's a wonderful show from NPR called Hidden Brain. And one of the things that I think really expresses the creativity that's possible in podcasting is there's a psychologically oriented podcast called Terrible Thanks for Asking. And it's a really interesting premise. This woman unfortunately lost her husband to brain cancer. She's a comedian, actually, and I think she was in her early 30s when this happened. And she was really devastated. So she would say to her friends when they would ask her how she is, she would say, "Well, I'm terrible. Thanks for asking." But it became a podcast, and it's really gotten hugely popular to help people, deal with pain and anxiety or frustrations or things that are going badly in their lives that they think can't be solved. For inspiration, Tom, I think your show is fantastic. I listened to, the Jordan Belfort episode. It was fantastic.
Oh, wow.
Gary Vee, terrific interviews. TED Radio Hour is very inspirational, and How I Built This, again from NPR. Startup, of course, from Gimlet. So I have a wide variety of shows that I listen to.
Well, I want to connect it because I had Hernan Lopez on, and I don't know if you know who he is. He started the Wondery Network, and so I had him on, and then my personal favorite show outside of this show, of course, is Business Wars, and I had it was David Bush, must be his name, and he is the host of Business Wars, and that might be a disconnection because it's one of those things where. I did an article on Hernan. He was a big Fox guy and who's in video and the movies for years, and he believes, like I do and you do, that podcasting is a medium of the future. So I'll definitely connect you guys, and more importantly, get the message out for PodSearch. So Dave, listen, this was, sorry, go ahead.
Listen, I got to tell you, Tom, I have so much respect for Hernan Lopez. He really tried to do something very different, and he's been exceptionally successful at it. And actually, if you go to podsearch.com and you type in the word Wondery in the top search bar, it will bring up all the Wondery shows.
And folks, I have not spoken to Dave before today. This is not planted. See, great minds think alike, and and I think honestly, candidly, I think PodSearch can. I think Wondery is a great content provider, and of course, Fernand's going to sell some great advertising. But I think something like PodSearch can bring not just Wondery, but shows like New Theory to the next level.
Absolutely, that's our goal, and because I'm so excited about the possibility of helping people discover this wonderful world of podcasting, both from the listener standpoint and also the advertising standpoint.
I love it. Dave, listen, check out everyone, podsearch.com. Put a link in the show notes as well. Dave, any parting thoughts?
I just want to say that, anyone who wants to listen to a podcast and think that it's too hard to find them or too hard to listen, try podsearch.com and browse around the categories, the subcategories, new shows, top shows. We even have videos about it, so please check it out. We would welcome you, and it's free.
Love it, Dave. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks a lot.